Okay, now we have almost come to the end of this series of lectures, and here in this short video, I want to go through the concepts together with you, and let us see if we can identify the nuanced differences between these different theoretical concepts. So on the slides, you can see a list of the theoretical concepts that we discussed in the series of lecture. We first discuss individual racism. We say that individual racism can be roughly defined as the individual level discrimination. It is something that is more explicit, and it is something that often occurs in interactions. But I also need to say that individual racism is not always necessarily so explicit. Later in this quarter, we will talk about microaggression, and it is a type of nuanced individual level racism. But we realize that racism is not only reproduced through the interaction between two individuals. Racism is reproduced within social institutions and sometimes in a more nuanced and implicit way. And for that, we have discussed institutional racism. In particular, we utilize education as a social institution. We define institutional racism as the process and the procedures within which the inequitable outcomes according to race is reproduced. And if you want to recall a concrete example of institutional racism, you can recall the example of how the norm of meritocracy may enlarge racial disparities within educational system. And you can also look for other examples in other important social institutions, such as the workplace, science, and even religion and family. But institutional racism does not really provide us a full and comprehensive picture of how different social institutions collaborate with each other, reproducing racism in our society. And for that, scholars raise the concept of structural racism. Structural racism highlights the interinstitutional collaboration. A salient and obvious example of structural racism is the collaboration between education and the workplace based on the assumption that if both of these social institutions perceive the norm of meritocracy as the institutional norms. Again, I need to highlight that it is a more hypothetical example and something that is relatively positive in terms of our examination of the reproduction of racism is that a lot of the educational organizations, universities, colleges, and workplace organizations, such as companies, are revisiting their institutional norms. So this is an hypothetical example, but it is a really powerful example to see how different social institutions or two seemingly irrelevant social institutions can collaborate with each other. And after this class, you may go online and find resources to find more concrete examples on how some really seemingly irrelevant institutions, such as the education and religion, can also collaborate with each other, reproducing racism in our society. Structural racism, although very comprehensive, does not really illustrate how racism is something that is rooted in the history. So scholars come up with the concept of systematic racism that situate the reproduction of racism in the history in racialized society, such as the United States. So these are the different types of racism that we discussed in the series of lectures. We then start to think about from a more abstract and theoretical level how race is formulated. We come into the racial formation theory constructed by two authors, Omi and Winnett, in 1968. In racial formation, they define the racial formation that they are interested in as the creation, transformation, inhabitation, and the destroy of racial categories. But they realize that the power of race is not necessarily only associated with racial categorization, but instead culture and social meanings attached to different racial categories. They then define the concept of racial project, which is the process within which the culture and social meanings or the socio-historical meanings are attached to different racial categories. We now realize that everyone may be able to participate in racial project, but some key stakeholders in the participation of racial projects include, according to Omi and Winnett, the government, namely the stakeholders who have power. But not every racial project is racist project. Racial project become racist project if it is established based on domination and or hegemony, and if it situates different racial categories on a hierarchy. So At this point, we have reviewed all the theoretical concepts that we have covered in this series of lecture. I understand that this may be the most and relatively intense, theoretically intense and dense lecture. So I would love to invite you to the discussion board, within which we will have some communications or dialogues to translate these seemingly abstract concepts to something that is more concrete. So I will see you in the discussion board.